Hey everyone, so one of my favorite parts of this process is working from the smalls and going up to the mediums and then even larger. I love the expansion of color. You have to use more color, you have to think about your brush work, you can stylize it a little bit more, you have to worry about composition. So this is craft paper. It's like a little bit less than cardstock weight, but it's still pretty thin. I bought this a while ago because I just wanted to paint on craft. I've got a couple notebooks and journals that I have craft paper in, but I really wanted them to be separate from a journal. I want to be able to do it on individual pieces. I put the link in the ColourPop class so you can go ahead and see that. It is not vital, and I by no means say this is the best paper I've ever worked on. I just like changing up surfaces that I work on, and I also like playing with the background color when I'm painting on it. I think that that's all a part of the color experience too, the color that you're painting on top of. And you see me kind of putting this down, but it's hard to see the edge of the paper, so I'm putting this white paper underneath it so I can kind of get a clean edge around it without making it wonky so I can see. So I'm taping two pieces. These are 8.5 by 11, like regular printer size paper, and I'm just taping them down to the board to get working just like I did the smalls. So once I've got them taped down to the board, this is a really important step because I want the background to stay that craft color. I am using clear gesso. I know it looks like it's white, but it will dry clear. And this is gesso that has a bit of a grit and it will take the porousness out. I talk about this a lot about needing to just prime the paper so it's not porous, so the paint doesn't just go there and stick and not roll across the surface. Now, as usual, I use way too much gesso and I have to actually clean my brush off as I'm doing this because I put too much on. So note to self, don't just pour it on like it's wild abandon. I put way too much on. You'll see me just kind of take the brush and be like, ugh, and then just wipe it off on the towel next to me. So put a normal sized amount on, let it dry, and then we'll get ready to start doing that freehand continuous line drawing on the pages to get them ready to start painting. So now that my obscene amount of gesso is dry, I'm ready to start doing that line drawing across. I'm using the graphite pencil, that favorite little guy of mine. Also, just want to mention that these papers will curl. If you're worried about your paper curling, these papers are going to curl. I'll show you some things you can kind of counterbalance it, but it doesn't make it perfect. A lot of times artists will just put these in like a cellophane sleeve, sell them as original art, or you can mount these to another canvas if you'd like to. You can kind of just glue them down to a board or whatever you want. I don't really care that much. I really just like using them as practices and kind of experimenting on what will happen if kind of things. You could also mimic something like this if you don't want to get the craft paper by maybe taking like a raw umber or a burnt umber and toning, they call it sizing, your piece of paper or a canvas or something like that with like a brown background. You can get similar results. So like I said, I like to refer back to these smalls all the time, find out the things that I like, find out the things that I don't like. And I'm going to pull from this one, that one that gave me so much trouble in the beginning. I really kind of like the color palette, so I'm going to go with that. And you'll just see me I would say experimenting very similarly like I did on the smalls, but with these larger ones. And I am using now a size 10. This is a bigger brush, putting that color down. You'll notice that this red was very transparent on the white and is less transparent on the brown, just given because the background is darker. And that's another thing to note as you're working through color as well. These colors are way more vibrant. They pop off of this darker background. So I show you this not because craft color is the best, but just the idea of when you're practicing like this, throwing in other options to see if they're part of something that you'd like to do in the future. Especially if you're working on a series, it might be really interesting to have some on white, some on gray, some on brown, some on black, and just play around with that color. But you can see just with that little small next to it, how that flower is a bit lackluster as compared to the flowers on the darker piece. And I really love the way they just kind of jump off of that piece. And I'm not doing anything different. I'm not even putting more paint, like gobs of paint down or anything. It's still a pretty loose amount of paint. The greens, I really like how even the greens play on the background as well. So we talked a little bit earlier about in this series, I'm really working on this more abstract version of things, almost making it illustrator-like, whimsical, because I'm not painting sophisticated vases or anything like that. I'm going to keep it kind of like this line. I like the play of the flat and the dimensional as well, and that's what we're doing here. You know, the vase is relatively static and the flowers are moving. So you can come to this too with all different kinds of ways you want to do it. Play around with the brown as the background of the vase. You know, just kind of have this freedom. And I'm going to try to keep that little brown line around the vase, separating the illusion of transparency as I'm working. Going back to how colors read on this brown surface, I just am in love with the way that second red shows up on this darker piece. When we use the white canvas, a lot of light shines through. When we use a darker background, you'll see that you're painting in more light than you are dark. You don't have to spend a lot of time adding darkness. It's a real easy job to do. More so, your time will be better spent adding in the light. And so I've referenced this a lot of times in classes when people say, why work on a dark background? And I always go back to Van Gogh, not only because he's my favorite, but I think he's a mastermind of color. So if Starry Night was painted on a white canvas, you can imagine how much paint it would take to cover up the background. If you started Starry Night on a navy blue background or a black background, you can imagine that you're not really going to spend a lot of time working in the base of the painting. You're going to spend most of your efforts building in the light. These are decisions you make as an artist. There's no right and wrong. It's more about owning the knowledge so that when you go to the painting, you can make a really educated decision about how to start it off. It's building another layer of your color portfolio by knowing that you could do less work. And maybe I'm a lazy artist, but I like the idea of allowing something like a background color to do a lot of that effort for me, and allowing colors to just sing when they need to sing, and letting light sing and shadow sing in a whole new way as they vibrate off of each other. And just, again, going back, I'm putting the layers. I've been doing these layers the same way. I work with a darker layer and then start adding in the light. I try to keep the integrity of a little bit of that shadow color peeking through. It gives it a less flat feel and a little bit more depth. But just even in these two colors, looking how they compare from this small white one to this darker background, it is just a beautiful difference and a great example of how just by changing up one element, you can make an entirely different piece. The purpose of the mediums, we've talked about this, is that you have to use space differently. You have to pick up amounts of color differently. You have to change your brush. You change the way you angle, in this case, around the flowers. There's a lot less room to play with on the small and a lot more to play with on the large. I've changed the composition. I've added more flowers because there's allowing more space on there. I referenced that the entire surface area, this is an 8.5 by 11, and now I need to work to make the entire 8.5 by 11 a piece of artwork as opposed to a 4 by 6. So I'm putting more effort in. I'm spraying just the palette just a little bit. I'm feeling like they're drying. And that has a lot to do with that super heavy gesso not truly being paint, but being having plaster of Paris in it. And the nature of that is to want to dry quickly. So you might find that you might need to spray your palette before you end for the day, or when you start working, or even continuously through the day. I'd also caution you, if you're working from a palette for a significant amount of time, just be very aware to put the lid on it when you walk away. That'll keep it viable much longer. Again, being very loose. Keep the looseness. Try not to overthink, especially on this one, since I put enough thought into this one on that small one. I've worked now with 3 of the values of that red color. Now I'm going into 4, even more pops of light. I have remembered to keep the vase pink above that horizon line, and I will remember to keep it green below, which was my issue before. And when I talk about flat and dimensional, this is a stylistic, this is a purposeful contrast. I am adding this illustrative like effect by just having this outline of the vase. Every once in a while, you'll see me brush over the stems with the pink or the green or something to kind of give them a little bit of a diffuse, but it's not a lot. I'm not trying to do that. And as the as the stems get more light, you see that they start to become dimensional. They almost kind of pop out at you as you add more light. The idea of working dark to light is again a reinforcement of there is depth to something. The darker colors recede and the lighter colors will come forward. So I'm pulling from two pieces now. You saw that when I pulled those aside, I pulled that top one, which is the turquoise, and that bottom one, which is the green and pink. So I'm using that to play around too. There is no reason why you should feel like you have to stay with the original smalls. You can play off of what you've learned from those smalls as well, as you see me doing here. And plus turquoise, right? I'm quite the scrubber. I go through brushes quickly, so that's why I like these. If you've not used these Simply Simmons brushes, they have a harder bristle, so they take a beating. They're like the Timexes of brushes, and they're really affordable. I've realized I made my shadow too thin for that vase, so I'm just going to widen that out. And the way you make your darks darker is sometimes making your lights lighter. So you'll see I kind of put that in there, and then I'll go lighter around that shadow. And I'm trying to keep a little part of the bottom of the vase with a shadow too. That's happiness right there. And I love the way the brown is peeking through to encapsulate or form a vessel for those flowers. Now this is different than the white. Obviously the white before alluded to light, and this is now alluding to shadow. But I believe, you know, as a total image, it's not playing with you. You're not like, why is that circle there? It does feel like they're in a vase, even though it's a shadow or a light. So, and I will play around with little pops of color around. I'll even play around in some of the paintings later and just painting in like a dark purple to make the vase instead of a white or something like that. So it's fun to play around with options as well. This should be, none of these pieces in any of these series, or probably any of my classes, I will actually put that out there. None of the works that we do in our classes are meant to be like, let's make spectacular art. They're all vehicles to learn more about a technique. In this case, it's pops of color. So don't get too precious about any of these works. These are your practices so that when you go to work on your own body of art, you have more knowledge to work from. And again, that's another reason to work on paper, because it doesn't feel like, oh, I've got to make this perfect. It has to be the best ever. Just adding in some more variant in the lights as I move around the piece. You'll probably find too, as you work through these pieces, you have a more comfortable size. My go-to size is 16 by 20. I think that's why I make it the larges in this class. Certainly I love to paint bigger, but my smallest kind of comfortable when I just go to the canvas or the easel on my own when no one's looking is about 16 by 20. But you're going to find that you have a size that is your comfortable, and that's another reason to offer this concept in different sizes too. Sometimes people think it's safer to work small. I actually think it doesn't give you enough room to explore. And you can see here I talked about just kind of diffusing some light across the stems to give it an illusion of a reflection, and that's what I did there. You see me kind of turning the brush too. That also, you can change brushes as you're working if you want to get different brush marks. I really like a filbert because I can work the edge, I can work the flat, I can kind of twist it to get different like thick and thin variants. I've changed the brush here. I've switched to a round, and that's when I said I'm just putting little taps of color so that it doesn't look so hard around the edges. And sometimes I'll pop in a surprise color in the in the painting, in either in the flowers or in the vase or in the horizon line. But all of that is awesome. Like, the more variety, the more risks you take, I think the more interesting a painting can get. And even here, like, I'm playing with that round brush. It's not my go-to brush. I'm making a hot mess there. Little tiny line I don't like, so I'm just going back in and making them bigger, broader, painterly brush marks. I like that way the red just kind of gave a little bit more depth to that horizon. It doesn't look as flat. It kind of pushes it back. And again, I go back to that dark colors recede and light colors come forward. This is that dark color. I'm kind of just adding in some shadow down there. I added at the top, but I'm not going all the way around it. Doesn't mean it would be bad if you did either. It's just, I kind of like the interest. Your eye wants to find pattern. So if you put little tick marks of color around, it kind of wants to find the things that are similar. So odd numbers are good. So if you've got 3 spaces or 4 marks, just 5 marks, you can kind of figure out what your eye feels more pleased by looking at. So going back to the originals, just to see what do I want to do next. Probably make decisions as I go when I'm painting as well. I might pull one thing out and then I'll kind of pull something else out if I feel it's not working the way I want. So I've taken a little bit of that dark turquoise into that darkest kind of, I'm calling it a neutral, but it really is like a dark blue, to get some variety as well. I did not do that in the original turquoise flowers, but if you see the flower above, that's small there with the red background, I've got a little bit of that in there. So I'm kind of melding the two. I just love the way the turquoise pops off of this. Isn't that spectacular? It so looks better on this darker background to start. It pops. So remember that as you work. And you don't have to use brown. You can really use any dark color. I always keep in mind, though, what colors I'm working with. Sometimes you can work with a color like we did in the first color pop. I took the blues from the palette and put them on the background. But it really also can be very interesting to pull a totally different color than you're working with. For example, let's just say the first painting, I chose a dark purple as a background and painted everything on it. It might be interesting, and I don't know what it would look like, but that's oftentimes the reason why I chose red to do backgrounds of florals and figurative. Many times my color palette stays pretty cool, and to get that pop of red or pop of warmth in there, I would choose red so that I didn't have to paint it in, because I don't really love working with warm colors. And when I say warm colors, yellows, reds, oranges, I will pop them in, and usually they're like the accent to a piece, or I'll put a red flower and everything else around it is cool. But that red will give me a pop of something that makes it more interesting. Again, working in value. I put the green stem. I like the dark blue center to that. It kind of brought in that dark blue I mixed with the turquoise in the flower. I almost feel like I could walk away from this painting as is. So when we're talking about abstract, I know I talk about making the background and the subject cohesive, that I want them to always be on the same page of the painting. There is something to be said about breaking that rule. If you stopped here, you totally could. It would be an interesting contrast to a painterly effect and an illustrative effect together. And that's why I wanted to do this really abstracted type of vase, because everybody comes to their love of art from different avenues and different places. And if you are a more whimsical artist, you probably like the play of flat and dimensional. And that's really where you can take these in different directions. So find what appeals to you. Take as many risks as you can on these practices, whether it's all, if you just do it in the smalls, or maybe you do it all the way through, because there is something to be said for finding the newness in your uniqueness. Tell me that yellow doesn't look great on there. Oh, yes. Love it. And you can't really see it on the smalls now, but the bottom left-hand corner, you can see that yellow on there. This just reads dirtier, earthier. And when you get to the lighter colors, because you've got this muted tone, and it's not because the color is any more muted, it's because these darker versions of these colors are way more transparent. The colors we used are transparent, so it's allowing some of that darkness in. Because they're so transparent, when we work on white, it allows the light in it, and white dulls color. I'll say that again. Light dulls color. If you think of candy apple red, pyro red, cadmium red paint, and you add white to it, it makes it a muted pink. So what's happening here is that darkness is actually giving a richness to the light colors instead of a dullness to the light colors. I'm going to go on a limb here and say that this one I'm painting right now is my favorite painting from the whole series. Doesn't discount everything. It's just, you know, like when you paint a painting and it just happens that easily, and it's just, you don't have to put a whole lot of effort into it, and you walk away and you're like, yes, I had a yes moment from this. And there's going to be paintings through this. It might be a small, it might be the big one. In the first series, I think the 16 by 20 was my walk away happy. But this one, there's something about the yellow in this piece that, and I'm not a yellow person, maybe it's the yellow next to the teal, but there's something about this palette specific that just made me happy. And it's one of the reasons I chose to mimic this in a different way on the 16 by 20. I wanted to see, okay, I love that. What happens if I put on the white, if it has more space, if I change the table color? So just know that I'm exploring with you in these colorways, and none of them are wrong. Just some of them, and you'll probably say, Donna, that's great, but I really like the one to the left better than I like the one to the right. And that's, again, it's all about what appeals to you. And as you go through these practices, these are things to note about the process. You will, without a doubt, not relate to one of these colors on the palette. I don't always relate to pink. I know that sounds weird, but I just don't always love pink as much as, like, say, these pink backgrounds with the yellow. I also want to throw in here, most of you have, smartphones, and you probably have an app on there where you can kind of keep notes. I do have, I use Reminder, and when I have those what if questions, I kind of put them in this reminder in this folder that's things to try, things to question. And as you're working through this, sometimes I forget when I'm working too about those what ifs. So if you're working with this and you have the what if, and you're painting, you're like, I'm going to finish this piece, but what if, and you forget. I always tell people to kind of keep a little running tally of those what if questions. And it might even be you're looking at your palette and you say something like, what if I was using manganese blue as something in the work? What if I used phthalo red? That's not even a color. I don't even want to say it, but you know what I mean. Those what if colors or what if thoughts are important because that's your gut talking. And as artists, a lot of what we do is intuitive. We don't even know how intuitive we are while we're working. And if you are at the point where the process isn't quite as intuitive, that's why it's important to keep note of those what if questions. And if you have a what if question that you can't answer on your own, I invite you to ask me, because maybe I have a what if answer for you. I forgot to leave that shadow there underneath that dead guy, putting that back in. And so because pink is not my comfortable color, I try to use it. Greens as backgrounds, or as, bigger portions, not just a stem, are also not my go-to color. So I keep in mind, why is it? What is it that I don't like about green that I find hard to work with? And I have heard this from a lot of people, that greens themselves, they find hard to work with. I think it's maybe finding the right color. Maybe I haven't found the right green yet, but I will eventually. The more I mix these colors, the more I will find the right green. But a lot of times greens can be transparent as well. Green gold is a great color, but if you've worked with it long enough, you know it's very transparent. So you have to add white to it or something like that to make it potent enough on your pieces. So as you're working through your color palettes and discovering colors, keep that in mind. What colors don't you use in your work ever? And can you find a color of that will work? They say that you should always have the complement of a color in your work, even if you don't like it. So yellow and purple. If you can find a spot where you can just touch a little bit of purple in your work, it usually makes your yellow look better. And that goes with all the complements, you know, blue and orange and red and green. You can see I put a little bit of that purple. It's a little touch, it's not a lot, into that flower center. When I do my paint like an artist classes, I encourage everybody to put all of the colors of the palette in there and kind of whittle out what they want. Usually they keep a color that they wouldn't normally just pick up to paint with. It's probably one of the most important things to take away from those courses as well, because it's the appreciation of color without the biases that we bring to it. You can see I was doing a little bit of color mixing on the fly. Could I make a green that was a little bit yellow? Don't feel like you have to stay just to the colors and the values that we mixed. All of these, play with the mixing of them. You'll see when I want a darker version of an orange, I might put a green in it, or that dark blue neutral that we have going there. Those mixes are important because sometimes they make neutrals that are a viable part of the design to help the pops show more. You can see here I've got I just put a little bit of tidge of that light purple down there at the bottom of the vase that alludes to light. I'll try not to frame it out, but there are, I think it's in the 16 by 20 where I actually frame the vase in that purple. All right, I'm just taking a Uniball pen, a black pen, writing my name down. My favorite part is tearing away the tape. I usually like to play with the design when I put my signature. I know that's not necessarily the most important part of this course, but play around where you like to put your signature. Do you make it part of the work? Do you not? Vincent van Gogh used to put his name in the work, and I kind of like that. So sometimes I try to incorporate it into the piece, or at least close. And it's hard to see the edge because the brown board is fighting with your eye, which is why I had that white paper underneath so I could see where the edge is. But when I take these off, I just love that craft colored edge. Ta-da! And the paper was just fitting on there. So you see I've got the tape wrapped around the edge of the board just to keep it down. I feel like too, when you frame your work, like in real frames, like float frames or put it under glass, the work changes. And I feel the same way about the edges on when you tape them down, so you have that crisp edge around it. I feel it does do something different to the work. It finishes it in a way, I guess, that I like. So these are wet and they're not quite curly, but they will curl at the end when they're totally dry. And I just put the white paper under there so you can see what that brown edge does to the finished pieces. And just showing like where the inspiration kind of came from, not literal. And then I want to show you just really quickly how there are a couple ways to counterbalance the curl. We put wet moisture on the front of them. So by putting a spray of water on the back, it can counterbalance the curl. It doesn't always work, and it depends on the paper. I'm just taking a clean brush and just making sure it's saturated across the back. I have been known to iron. I take a piece of wax paper on the artwork itself and flip it over and iron the back with a warm iron. You can see they're curling a little bit more until they dry. And the other thing is you can put a little bit of tape on the back if they're curling a lot. It's not perfect, but it does make it a little stronger and it will keep it from curling just a little bit. I usually don't care about it, but I know that some of you are bothered by the curl, so I wanted to just show you what I do sometimes to fix the curl.